Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. On the 15th of March, in the year 44 BCE, a group of Roman senators surrounded a single man on the floor of the Senate House and stabbed him 23 times. The man was Gaius Julius Caesar, general, statesman, author, lover, dictator, the most powerful human being in the Western world, and within minutes, a corpse on a marble floor stained with his own blood. His killers believed they were saving the Roman Republic. They were wrong. What they actually did was destroy it completely, accelerating by violence the very transformation they had tried to prevent through murder. Caesar's life is one of the most thoroughly documented of any figure from the ancient world, partly because he was, among his many talents, an exceptional writer who left behind his own accounts of his military campaigns, and partly because he was simply too important for his contemporaries to ignore. Historians, biographers, poets, and politicians wrote about him obsessively, both during his life and for centuries after his death, and the resulting portrait, pieced together from his own writing, from the accounts of his allies and his enemies, from the physical evidence of inscriptions and coins and the city he transformed, is one of the richest and most complex character studies that antiquity has left us. He was a man of contradictions that never fully resolved, an aristocrat who built his career on popular support, a brilliant writer whose prose style was famous for its clarity and restraint, who also possessed one of the most reckless and audacious military minds of the ancient world, a man capable of extraordinary mercy toward his defeated enemies, who also ordered the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the course of his campaigns, a politician who claimed to be restoring the dignity of Rome while accumulating more personal power than any Roman had held in the 5-century history of the Republic. This is his story, from an aristocratic family in decline, through the long climb to power, through the conquest that made him famous, through the civil war that made him supreme, to the assassination that made him immortal and ended, in the same violent stroke, the world that had produced him. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in July of 100 BCE into a patrician family, the Julii, that claimed descent from the goddess Venus through her son Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman people. This claim of divine ancestry was a significant part of the family's identity and would later become central to Caesar's own political self-presentation. But at the time of his birth, the Julii were a family of ancient lineage and modest contemporary influence. They had not produced a consul, the highest elected office in the Roman Republic, in several generations. Patrician status gave the family social prestige, but not, by itself, political power, and the young Caesar grew up understanding that his family's name carried weight that its recent achievements did not fully justify. Rome in the year of Caesar's birth was a city in the midst of profound political crisis. The traditional structures of the Republic, the system of annually elected magistrates, the Senate of accumulated wisdom and experience, the popular assemblies that gave ordinary citizens a voice in governance, were under increasing strain from the social and economic transformations that 2 centuries of imperial expansion had produced. Wealth from conquered territories flowed into Rome in extraordinary quantities, enriching some Romans spectacularly, while displacing small farmers whose land was absorbed into vast estates worked by enslaved labor. The army, traditionally composed of property-owning citizens serving out of civic duty, was increasingly filled with landless men who depended on their generals rather than the state for their economic security after service, a development that would prove decisive in Caesar's own rise to power. The political conflict between the Optimates, the conservative faction that sought to preserve the traditional dominance of the senatorial aristocracy, and the Populars, the faction that built political power through appeals to the common citizens and the popular assemblies, had already produced serious violence in Roman politics by the time Caesar was a young man. The reforming brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus had both been murdered in political violence in the previous generation, the first instances of Romans killing fellow Romans for political reasons in the history of the Republic, opening a door that would not close again. Caesar's family had popular sympathies and popular connections. His aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, the great general and seven-time consul who had reformed the Roman army and who led the popular faction in its bloody conflict with the Optimate faction led by Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Caesar was a teenager, Sulla seized power as dictator and conducted a brutal purge of his political enemies. The proscriptions, in which the names of those marked for death were posted publicly, their property confiscated, and rewards offered to anyone who killed them. Caesar, related by marriage to Marius and married himself to the daughter of Marius's ally Cinna, was directly threatened. Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia. Caesar refused, a decision of remarkable boldness for a teenager facing the wrath of the most powerful and most ruthless man in Rome. The refusal nearly cost him his life. He was stripped of his inheritance and his wife's dowry, and he was forced to go into hiding, moving from one refuge to another in the hills outside Rome while Sulla's agents searched for him. He was eventually captured but managed to bribe the soldiers holding him and influential family friends, including the Vestal Virgins, whose intercession carried enormous religious and social weight, eventually persuaded Sulla to spare him. Sulla reportedly relented with a famous warning to those who had pleaded for Caesar's life, that they should beware this young man, for there were many Mariuses in him. The old dictator, in one of antiquity's more prescient observations, had recognized something dangerous and exceptional in the young man he had nearly killed. Caesar left Rome for military service in Asia Minor, where he served with distinction and was awarded the civic crown, one of the Roman military's highest honors, awarded for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle for his conduct at the siege of Mytilene. It was during this period of early military service that one of the most famous episodes of his young life occurred. Sailing across the Aegean, he was captured by pirates, who were at this time a significant and largely unchecked menace throughout the eastern Mediterranean. When the pirates set his ransom at 20 talents of silver, Caesar reportedly laughed and insisted they raise it to 50, as if to suggest that his life was worth far more than they had calculated. While the ransom was being collected, he spent his weeks of captivity composing poetry and speeches and reading them to his captors, jokingly threatening to have them all crucified once he was free. The pirates found this entertaining. When the ransom arrived and Caesar was released, he immediately raised a naval force, hunted down the pirates who had held him, and had them crucified exactly as he had promised, though, in a gesture his biographers note approvingly, he first had their throats cut as a mercy before crucifixion, sparing them the prolonged agony of the usual punishment. This episode, recorded by several ancient biographers, captures qualities that would define Caesar's entire career: the audacious self-confidence bordering on arrogance, the genuine personal courage, the capacity for both ruthlessness and a certain measure of mercy, and an evident enjoyment of theater and reputation building even in moments of genuine danger. His return to Rome after Sulla's death in 78 BCE marked the beginning of his deliberate climb through the cursus honorum, the established sequence of public offices through which an ambitious Roman aristocrat built his political career. He served as a military tribune, then as quaestor in Spain, then as aedile in Rome, where he won enormous popularity by staging lavish public games and gladiatorial spectacles at his own expense, going deeply into debt to fund displays that won him the affection of the Roman population in a way that more cautious political calculation would never have achieved. His debts during this period were so enormous that he reportedly told his mother, on the morning he left to take up the governorship of Spain that would finally allow him to begin paying them off, that he would return as either consul or as a bankrupt fugitive. There was no middle ground he was willing to accept. His political alliances during these years of advancement were calculated with the same boldness that characterized his personal conduct. In 60 BCE, he formed an informal political alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey the Great, the brilliant general whose military victories in the East had made him immensely wealthy and immensely popular, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputed to be the wealthiest man in Rome, whose fortune had been built partly through ruthless real estate speculation during the chaos of the Sullan proscriptions. This alliance, which modern historians call the First Triumvirate, though the Romans themselves never used this term, was not a formal office or institution but a private agreement among three powerful men to support each other's political ambitions and override the resistance of the Senate, which feared and distrusted all three of them individually and collectively. Through this alliance, Caesar secured the consulship for 59 BCE, the highest office in the Republic, and used his year in office to push through legislation that benefited his allies and built his own political base, often through methods that bordered on or crossed into outright intimidation of his senatorial opponents. At the end of his consular year, through arrangements negotiated with his allies, he secured the governorship of Gaul, a province that would give him an extended military command, a large army, and the opportunity to win the kind of military glory and personal wealth that Roman political culture rewarded above almost everything else. The Gallic Wars, which Caesar conducted from 58 to 50 BCE, transformed him from an ambitious but still relatively conventional Roman politician into one of the most famous military commanders in history. And they transformed Gaul, the territory of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany, from an independent collection of Celtic tribal confederations into a Roman province that would remain part of the Roman world for the next 5 centuries and whose Romanization would shape the linguistic and cultural development of Western Europe permanently. Caesar's own account of these campaigns, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, is one of the most important surviving works of Latin prose, written in a spare, clear, declarative style that Roman literary tradition particularly admired, and that has made the text a standard for students learning Latin for 2,000 years since. The commentaries were not simply a military record. They were a sustained piece of political self-promotion, written and circulated in Rome during the campaigns themselves to keep Caesar's name and achievements in the public consciousness while he was absent from the city, building the popular support that would prove essential to his political survival in the conflicts to come. The campaigns themselves were extraordinary in their scope and their brutality. Caesar's own figures, which modern historians treat with appropriate skepticism given his evident interest in maximizing his achievements, claim that the wars resulted in the deaths of approximately 1 million Gauls and the enslavement of approximately 1 million more, out of a total Gallic population that may have been around 6 to 8 million. Even allowing for exaggeration, the scale of violence and displacement involved in the Roman conquest of Gaul was immense, and modern historians have increasingly described the campaign in terms that acknowledge its character as a sustained and devastating war of conquest rather than the more sanitized account of civilizing pacification that Roman and later European tradition sometimes preferred. The most dramatic single episode of the Gallic Wars was the Great Rebellion led by Vercingetorix, a young nobleman of the Arverni tribe who managed, in 52 BCE, to unite a coalition of Gallic tribes that had previously fought each other as often as they had fought Rome into a coordinated resistance movement. Vercingetorix adopted a scorched earth strategy, denying Caesar's army the supplies it needed by destroying Gallic settlements and crops in its path, and he won a significant victory over Caesar's forces at the Battle of Gergovia, one of the few clear defeats Caesar suffered in his entire military career. The climactic confrontation came at the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his forces took refuge in a hilltop fortress and Caesar's army. Though significantly outnumbered by the combined Gallic forces, Vercingetorix's army within the fortress and a massive relief army that arrived from outside constructed an extraordinary system of double fortifications. An inner ring of walls and ditches facing the besieged fortress, and an outer ring facing outward against the relief army, trapping Caesar's forces between two enemy armies while simultaneously containing both. The engineering achievement involved in constructing these fortifications, stretching for many kilometers, incorporating towers, ditches, sharpened stakes, and other defensive works under active military pressure, was remarkable even by the standards of Roman military engineering, which was itself the most sophisticated in the ancient world. The siege succeeded. The relief army was defeated, the fortress fell, and Vercingetorix surrendered himself personally to Caesar, riding out from the fortress in his finest armor and laying his weapons at Caesar's feet in a gesture of formal submission that ancient and modern artists have depicted repeatedly as one of the iconic images of the entire conquest. Vercingetorix was held prisoner for 6 years and then executed as part of the public celebrations of Caesar's eventual triumph in Rome, a fate that, however brutal by modern standards, was entirely consistent with Roman practice toward defeated enemy leaders who had led significant resistance against Roman power. The conquest of Gaul gave Caesar everything that Roman political culture valued most: military glory of the first order, enormous personal wealth extracted from the conquered territory, the unwavering loyalty of a battle-hardened army that had followed him through 8 years of difficult campaigning, and a body of literary work that kept his name prominent in Roman political life throughout his absence. It also gave him something else, the realization, which would prove decisive in the years to come, that an army's loyalty to its general could exceed its loyalty to the Roman state itself, a realization that several of his predecessors had already exploited and that he would exploit on a scale none of them had attempted. While Caesar was campaigning in Gaul, the political situation in Rome deteriorated. Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate, was killed in 53 BCE during a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, removing one leg of the three-way balance of power. Pompey, increasingly alarmed by Caesar's growing military reputation and his accumulation of personal wealth and loyal troops, drew closer to the conservative Optimate faction in the Senate that had always distrusted Caesar and that now saw in Pompey a potential instrument for checking Caesar's ambitions. The personal alliance between the two men, cemented for years by the marriage of Pompey to Caesar's daughter Julia, was further strained when Julia died in childbirth in 54 BCE, removing one of the most important personal bonds holding the relationship together. By 50 BCE, the Senate, dominated by Caesar's Optimate opponents and increasingly supported by Pompey, was demanding that Caesar give up his military command and his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where he would be vulnerable to prosecution for various illegal acts he had allegedly committed during his consulship a decade earlier, prosecutions that, if successful, would end his political career and possibly his life. Caesar, for his part, demanded that he be allowed to stand for a second consulship in absentia, maintaining his military command and his legal immunity until he could take office and thereby avoid the period of vulnerability between giving up his provincial command and assuming a new position of power. The negotiations between Caesar and the Senate, conducted through intermediaries over many months, failed to produce a compromise that both sides found acceptable. In January of 49 BCE, the Senate passed its final decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the emergency measure that authorized the consuls to take whatever action was necessary to defend the state, effectively a declaration that Caesar was now considered an enemy of Rome unless he complied with the Senate's demands. Two tribunes who supported Caesar, including Mark Antony, fled Rome and made their way to Caesar's camp, reporting that their lives had been threatened and that the Senate had effectively declared war on him. Caesar's decision at this moment is one of the most consequential in Roman history. He commanded one legion at Ravenna, near the border between his province and Italy proper, marked by the small river called the Rubicon. Roman law strictly forbade any general from bringing his army across this boundary into Italy. To do so was to commit an act of war against the Roman state itself. Caesar, according to the ancient sources, hesitated at the river's edge, fully aware of the magnitude of what he was about to do. Suetonius records that he finally said, in Greek, "The die is cast, alia iacta est," in the more famous Latin rendering that has become proverbial, and led his army across. The Roman civil war that followed lasted, in its various phases, for nearly 4 years, and ultimately drew in much of the Mediterranean world. Pompey, despite commanding far greater overall resources and the loyalty of the Senate, made the fateful decision to abandon Italy rather than face Caesar's veteran legions immediately, retreating first to Greece to gather and train a larger force. Caesar, demonstrating the speed and decisiveness that had characterized his Gallic campaigns, moved with remarkable rapidity to secure Italy, then turned to deal with Pompeian forces in Spain before finally crossing to Greece to confront Pompey directly. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in central Greece in August of 48 BCE. Pompey commanded a significantly larger army, but Caesar's veteran legions, combined with superior tactical generalship, won a decisive victory. Pompey fled the battlefield and eventually made his way to Egypt, hoping to find refuge and support from the Ptolemaic court, where his family had long-standing political connections. Instead, the advisors of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, believing that killing Pompey would win them favor with the victorious Caesar, had him murdered as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit, he was presented with Pompey's severed head, a gift that, according to the ancient sources, did not please him as his hosts had expected, but instead provoked genuine grief and anger at the murder of a man who had once been his ally, his friend, and his son-in-law. Caesar's time in Egypt, where he became entangled in the Egyptian dynastic conflict between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII, and ultimately supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne, established a relationship and a political alliance that would have significant consequences for the remainder of his life and for the subsequent history of Rome. His son with Cleopatra, Caesarion, would later become a central and tragic figure in the final chapter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, killed on the orders of Caesar's own adopted heir Octavian after Cleopatra's death. The civil war did not end with Pompey's death. Caesar spent the following years pursuing and defeating Pompey's remaining supporters and family members across the Mediterranean world, in North Africa, where he defeated a Pompeian army at the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BCE, and finally in Spain, where he defeated Pompey's sons at the brutal Battle of Munda in 45 BCE, the last major military engagement of the Civil War and reportedly among the hardest-fought battles of his entire career. Caesar's treatment of his defeated enemies throughout the Civil War was notable for its policy of clemency, a deliberate political strategy that he pursued consistently and that distinguished his conduct from the brutal prescriptions that had characterized Sulla's earlier dictatorship. Many of the men who had fought against him, including some who would later be among his assassins, were pardoned, restored to their positions, and in some cases promoted to high office under his subsequent rule. This policy of clemency was genuinely popular and was presented by Caesar's propaganda as evidence of his magnanimity and his commitment to healing the divisions the Civil War had created. It also, in a bitter irony that the events of March 44 BCE would demonstrate, preserved the lives of several of the men who would ultimately conspire to kill him. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE as the unchallenged master of the Roman world, and the constitutional position he constructed for himself in the months that followed represented an unprecedented concentration of power within the formal structures of a republic that had, for nearly 5 centuries, been organized specifically to prevent any single individual from accumulating exactly this kind of authority. He was appointed dictator, an office with ancient precedent in Roman constitutional law, traditionally granted for a limited term during genuine military emergencies. But the dictatorship that Caesar held was extended repeatedly, and finally, in February of 44 BCE, just weeks before his death, the Senate granted him the dictatorship in perpetuity, dictator perpetuo, removing the temporal limitation that had always been central to the office's constitutional legitimacy. The honors and powers that accumulated around Caesar during this period went well beyond the traditional dictatorship. He was granted the title of imperator as a permanent component of his name rather than merely a military acclamation. His image appeared on coins minted during his lifetime, itself an unprecedented honor for a living Roman, since previous coinage had depicted only gods, mythological figures, or the distant ancestors of noble families, never a living political figure. He was granted the right to wear the purple robe and laurel wreath traditionally associated with the ancient kings of Rome on state occasions. A statue of him was placed among the statues of the 7 legendary kings of Rome on the Capitoline Hill. The month of his birth, Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor, the origin of our modern July, one of the most lasting linguistic monuments to any individual in human history. These honors, and the suspicion that Caesar harbored genuine ambitions toward formal kingship, a word and a concept that carried profound and visceral negative associations in Roman political culture, rooted in the traditional narrative of the expulsion of the last Roman king nearly 5 centuries earlier, generated increasing anxiety among the Roman senatorial aristocracy. The famous episode at the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 BCE, in which Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem before a crowd of Roman citizens, and Caesar, after gauging the muted and uncertain public reaction, refused it. An episode that some historians interpret as a deliberate test of public opinion regarding the possibility of formal monarchy, only intensified the suspicions of those who feared that Caesar intended to formally abolish the republic and establish a hereditary monarchy in its place. Caesar's actual political program during his brief period of supreme power, separate from the question of his personal honors and titles, involved genuine and substantial reforms that addressed long-standing problems in Roman governance. He reformed the calendar, replacing the inaccurate lunar calendar that Roman tradition had used for centuries with a solar calendar of 365 and a quarter days, the Julian calendar, which, with the relatively minor adjustments introduced by the later Gregorian reform, remains the basis of the calendar used across the world today. He initiated major public works projects, including plans for a new forum, a public library, and significant improvements to Rome's harbor facilities. He extended Roman citizenship to several provincial communities, continuing the gradual process of incorporation that had always distinguished Roman expansion from the more narrowly extractive imperial models of other ancient civilizations. He reformed the administration of the provinces, addressing some of the corruption and exploitation that had characterized provincial governance under the late Republic. He resettled tens of thousands of his veteran soldiers and members of the urban poor in colonies across the Mediterranean world, addressing the chronic problem of landlessness that had destabilized Roman politics for generations. These reforms suggest a ruler genuinely engaged with the practical challenges of governing an empire that had long since outgrown the political institutions originally designed for a single city-state. and they have led some modern historians to argue that Caesar's ultimate political vision, whatever his personal ambitions regarding titles and honors, was oriented toward creating a more effective and more centralized system of imperial governance, essentially anticipating, by several decades, the structure that his adopted heir Octavian would eventually establish as the Roman Empire. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar in the early months of 44 BCE involved as many as 60 senators, led principally by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus's involvement carried particular symbolic weight and particular personal poignancy. He was a descendant, or claimed descent, from the legendary Lucius Junius Brutus, who had led the expulsion of Rome's last king nearly 500 years earlier and had founded the Republic, a lineage that the conspirators and their sympathizers invoked explicitly in graffiti and pamphlets calling on Brutus to live up to his ancestors' example. He was also, according to persistent ancient rumor that modern historians cannot fully confirm or deny, possibly Caesar's own biological son, the product of Caesar's long-standing affair with Brutus's mother Servilia, which began when Brutus was already a young man and which Caesar maintained for years. Whether or not the rumor was true, Caesar had treated Brutus with conspicuous favor throughout his career, pardoning him after he fought for Pompey in the Civil War and promoting him to significant positions of honor and responsibility in the years that followed. The conspirators, who called themselves the Liberators, believed sincerely that they were acting to save the Roman Republic from the establishment of a hereditary monarchy, restoring the traditional balance of senatorial governance that Caesar's accumulation of personal power had displaced. They planned the assassination for the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month in the traditional Roman calendar, choosing the meeting of the Senate, scheduled to take place in the Curia attached to the theater that Pompey had built, as the setting for the act. Caesar had reportedly received various warnings in the days before the assassination, a soothsayer's warning to beware the Ides of March, which Suetonius and Plutarch both record and which has become proverbial. Disturbing dreams reported by his wife Calpurnia on the night before his death, in which she saw him murdered in her arms, even, according to some accounts, an unread letter detailing the conspiracy that was pressed into his hand as he walked to the Senate that morning, but that he did not read before the attack began, perhaps assuming it was simply another routine petition. He had also, by most accounts, dismissed his Spanish bodyguard some time before, perhaps from a genuine sense of security in his position or perhaps from a kind of fatalistic weariness with the precautions that constant vigilance required. When he entered the Senate chamber on the morning of the 15th of March, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretext of presenting a petition. Tullius Cimber seized his toga, the prearranged signal, and Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow, a glancing wound to the neck or shoulder. In the chaos that followed, the other conspirators, who had concealed daggers beneath their togas, fell upon him. Caesar reportedly attempted briefly to resist and to escape, but finding himself surrounded on every side, he covered his head with his toga and ceased to struggle. According to the most famous account, when he saw Brutus among his attackers, he said, in Greek, "Kai su, teknon," you too, child, though Shakespeare's later and far more famous Latin rendering, T2, brute, has become so thoroughly embedded in subsequent cultural memory that it has effectively displaced the more historically reliable Greek version in popular consciousness. Some ancient sources suggest he said nothing at all once he recognized the futility of resistance, simply drawing his toga over his face and accepting his fate with the same composure that had characterized his conduct throughout his extraordinary life. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, the rival he had defeated in civil war, struck by 23 wounds, of which, according to the physician who examined the body, only one, a wound to the chest, was definitively fatal. He was 55 years old. The immediate aftermath of the assassination did not unfold as the conspirators had anticipated. They had expected that the Roman public and the Senate, freed from Caesar's domination, would rally to their cause and celebrate the restoration of the Republic. Instead, the city descended into confusion and fear. The conspirators, having planned the assassination itself with meticulous care, had given remarkably little thought to what should happen afterward, and they found themselves isolated, barricaded on the Capitoline Hill, uncertain of their support and increasingly aware that the Roman population, far from celebrating Caesar's death as a liberation, was reacting with shock, grief, and in many cases, anger. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, who had survived the assassination because the conspirators had deliberately decided to limit their violence to Caesar alone, recovered his political footing within days and delivered, at Caesar's public funeral, an oration that turned public sentiment decisively against the conspirators. The funeral oration that Shakespeare later dramatized so famously, with its repeated ironic refrain that Brutus is an honorable man, was based on the historical accounts of Antony's actual performance, which combined the reading of Caesar's will, in which Caesar left substantial bequests directly to the Roman citizenry and adopted his young grandnephew Octavian as his heir, with a carefully calculated display of Caesar's bloodied and torn toga, inflaming the crowd's grief into a riot that drove the assassins from the city. The will itself proved to be one of the most consequential documents in Roman history. Caesar's posthumous adoption of his 18-year-old grandnephew Gaius Octavius as his son and principal heir transformed an obscure young man with no significant military or political experience into the legal heir of the most powerful figure in the Roman world, possessing Caesar's name, Caesar's wealth, and crucially, the loyalty that many of Caesar's veteran soldiers and supporters were prepared to transfer to anyone who carried his name and claimed his legacy. Octavian, who would eventually take the name Augustus and become the first Roman emperor, used this inheritance with a political skill that, in retrospect, suggests he may have been an even more capable politician than his adoptive father, however much he lacked Caesar's military genius and personal charisma in his early years. The civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination lasted, in various phases, for 13 years and were considerably bloodier and more destructive than the original conflict between Caesar and Pompey. Antony and Octavian, despite deep personal distrust and rivalry, initially allied with each other and with a third figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, in the Second Triumvirate, hunting down and killing Caesar's assassins in a new round of proscriptions even more extensive and more brutal than Sulla's had been decades earlier. Brutus and Cassius, who had fled to the eastern provinces to raise armies, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, and both took their own lives rather than face capture, in scenes that classical tradition treated with a certain tragic dignity, even while condemning the act of regicide they had committed. The eventual victory of Octavian over Antony, culminating in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE and the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt the following year, brought the cycle of civil wars to its final conclusion and established Octavian as the sole and unchallenged ruler of the Roman world. In 27 BCE, Octavian, adopting the title Augustus and carefully maintaining the outward forms and institutions of the Republic while exercising effectively unchallenged personal authority, established the constitutional arrangement that historians call the Principate, the system of rule by a single emperor, however carefully disguised in republican language, that would govern Rome for the next 5 centuries in the West and considerably longer in the Byzantine East. In this sense, the conspirators who killed Caesar to save the Republic achieved precisely the opposite of their intention. The republic that Caesar had bent but not entirely broken was destroyed completely in the chaos that followed his assassination, and the monarchical system of governance that the conspirators feared Caesar was establishing was created more thoroughly and more permanently by the very man whose adoption Caesar's death had made possible. Within 2 decades of the Ides of March, Rome had an emperor in everything but name, and within a few more decades, Augustus's successors would abandon even the pretense of republican restraint that he had so carefully maintained. Caesar's own writings remain among the most important surviving works of classical Latin literature, valued both for their historical content and for their literary qualities. The commentaries on the Gallic War and the commentaries on the Civil War, written in his characteristic spare and economical prose style, were studied by Roman schoolchildren learning Latin composition for centuries and remain, to this day, among the standard texts used in the teaching of classical Latin in schools and universities across the world. His prose style, clear, direct, devoid of unnecessary ornamentation, capable of conveying complex military and political situations with remarkable economy, was praised by his contemporary Cicero, himself the greatest prose stylist of the age and no particular friend to Caesar's political ambitions, as a model of correct and elegant Latin. The cultural and political legacy that Caesar left behind extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his life and death. His name became, quite literally, the word for supreme ruler in numerous European languages. The German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar both derived directly from Caesar, carried forward through the title that Roman and later Byzantine and Holy Roman emperors used to claim continuity with his authority. The month of July still bears his name in the modern calendar that, with minor adjustments, still governs the daily lives of billions of people across the world. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" remains in common usage as a metaphor for any decisive and irreversible action, a reference understood by people who have never read a word of Caesar's own writing or studied a single detail of Roman history. His assassination has been dramatized, analyzed, and reinterpreted continuously across the centuries since his death, perhaps most famously in Shakespeare's play, which, while taking certain dramatic liberties with the historical record, captured something genuinely important about the moral and political ambiguity at the heart of the story. The conspirators' sincere belief that they were acting for the good of the Republic, set against the genuine catastrophe that their action precipitated, a catastrophe that arguably made the Republic's destruction more complete and more permanent than Caesar's continued life might ever have achieved. The question of how to assess Caesar, as a brilliant reformer cut down before he could complete a genuinely beneficial transformation of an outdated and dysfunctional political system, or as a dangerous and ultimately destructive figure whose personal ambition undermined 5 centuries of republican governance, has never been definitively resolved, and it remains, more than 2,000 years after his death, a subject of genuine historical debate rather than settled consensus. What is not in question is the scale of his impact. Few individuals in human history have so thoroughly and so permanently altered the trajectory of an entire civilization. The Rome that existed before Caesar and the Rome that existed after him were, in the most fundamental structural sense, different political entities, and the world that grew from imperial Rome, the legal traditions, the administrative structures, the very concept of a unified Mediterranean civilization governed from a single center, bears the unmistakable imprint of the conquests and the constitutional transformations that Caesar set in motion. He died believing, by most accounts, that he had years of further achievement ahead of him. Plans for a major campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat and death, further public works projects in Rome, further reforms to the structure of provincial governance. The conspirators who killed him believed they were ending a threat to liberty before it could become permanent and irreversible. Both of these beliefs were, in their own ways, mistaken about what would actually follow. Caesar did not have years remaining, and liberty, in the sense the conspirators understood it, the rule of the Senate and the traditional aristocracy, the absence of any single dominant individual standing above the collective governance of the Roman elite, did not survive his death by more than a matter of months, swept away in the chaos and bloodshed of the civil wars that his assassination unleashed. The political and social world that produced Caesar deserves deeper examination, because understanding the structures he eventually overturned helps explain both why his rise was possible and why it was so destabilizing. The Roman Republic, in its mature form, was not a democracy in the modern sense, but a complex mixed constitution that ancient observers like the Greek historian Polybius admired precisely for its internal checks and balances. Executive power was held by two consuls, elected annually, each capable of vetoing the other's actions, preventing the concentration of authority that a single ruler would represent. The Senate, composed of several hundred men who had previously held public office, provided continuity, accumulated experience, and a forum for elite deliberation, though its decisions technically carried only advisory rather than strictly binding legal weight. Several popular assemblies, in which Roman citizens voted directly on legislation and elections, provided the formal mechanism through which the broader citizen body participated in governance, though the structure of these assemblies, particularly the weighting of votes by wealth in the centuriate assembly, ensured that wealthy citizens retained disproportionate influence over outcomes. This system had functioned, with periodic crises and adjustments, for nearly 4 centuries by the time Caesar was born, governing first a single city, then an Italian confederation, and eventually a Mediterranean-wide empire of extraordinary scale and diversity. The fundamental problem that the late Republic faced, and that Caesar's career both exploited and ultimately resolved through extra-constitutional means, was that the institutions designed for governing a city-state had never been adequately adapted to the realities of governing an empire. The annual rotation of magistrates, sensible for preventing tyranny in a small city, created chronic instability in provincial administration, where governors with only 1 or 2 years in office had limited incentive for long-term, sustainable governance and considerable incentive for short-term personal enrichment. The citizen militia model of military service, appropriate for defending a single city's immediate territory, broke down entirely when armies needed to campaign for years at a time in distant provinces, creating the conditions for the rise of professional, semi-permanent armies whose loyalty increasingly attached to their commanding generals rather than to the abstract entity of the Roman state. Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, had been central to this transformation through his military reforms of the late 2nd century BCE, which opened military service to landless citizens who had previously been excluded from the legions due to property qualifications. This reform addressed a genuine manpower crisis that Rome's continuous wars had created, but it also fundamentally altered the relationship between soldiers and the state. These landless recruits depended entirely on their general for their pay, their training, their share of plunder, and crucially, for the land grants that would provide for their retirement after years of service, grants that only a general with sufficient political influence could secure for them through the Senate or the popular assemblies. The loyalty this created was intensely personal rather than institutional, and it was this personal loyalty, built over years of shared campaigning and shared danger, that Caesar would eventually leverage when he led his army across the Rubicon. The social and economic transformations of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE compounded these political tensions. The vast wealth flowing into Rome from conquered territories, while enriching the city and its elite spectacularly, also produced devastating inequality. Small farmers, who had traditionally formed the backbone of both Roman agriculture and the citizen militia, found themselves unable to compete with the massive estates, worked by enslaved labor captured in foreign wars, that wealthy senators and equestrians increasingly accumulated. Displaced rural populations flowed into Rome itself, creating a large urban population dependent on grain distributions and susceptible to the populist political appeals that ambitious politicians, including Caesar himself throughout his career, learned to exploit with increasing sophistication. Caesar's early political career, before his Gallic command transformed him into a figure of independent military power, was conducted entirely within this fraught and increasingly violent political environment. His aedileship, during which he staged the lavish games that won him enormous popular goodwill while plunging him deeply into debt, exemplifies a broader pattern in late Republican politics, in which ambitious aristocrats competed for popular favor through increasingly extravagant displays of generosity, financed through loans that could only be repaid through the subsequent acquisition of a profitable provincial governorship or military command. This created a structural incentive toward continuous escalation. Each ambitious politician needed to outspend his predecessors and rivals to secure popular support, driving up the debts that could only be discharged through the kind of provincial exploitation or military conquest that further destabilized the empire's periphery and further enriched and empowered individual generals at the expense of collective senatorial governance. His election as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BCE, the chief priesthood of the Roman state religion, is worth particular attention, both because it represented a remarkable political achievement for a man still relatively early in his career, and because it illustrates the close intertwining of religious and political authority in Roman public life. The position was nominally a religious one, but it carried substantial political prestige and influence, and Caesar's victory in the election, achieved through what ancient sources suggest was extensive and possibly illegal bribery, demonstrated both his growing political network and his willingness to use whatever resources were necessary to secure positions of influence. The office came with an official residence in the Forum itself, placing Caesar physically at the center of Roman political life for the remainder of his career, and it gave him formal authority over numerous aspects of state religious practice, including the calendar, which he would later reform so dramatically. The Catalan conspiracy of 63 BCE, which occurred during Cicero's consulship and shortly after Caesar had secured election to the praetorship for the following year, provides an important episode for understanding Caesar's political positioning during this period. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a patrician who had failed repeatedly to win the consulship through legitimate means, organized a conspiracy involving armed insurrection and the assassination of various senators, including Cicero himself. When the conspiracy was exposed and several conspirators captured, the Senate debated their fate, and Caesar argued forcefully against the death penalty that Cicero and most senators favored, advocating instead for life imprisonment in various Italian towns, on the grounds that execution without formal trial set a dangerous precedent for the arbitrary exercise of senatorial power against Roman citizens. His argument, though ultimately rejected in favor of immediate execution, demonstrated both genuine legal and constitutional principle and a shrewd political calculation, since his position aligned him with popular sentiment that would prove valuable in subsequent years, even as it briefly exposed him to suspicion of complicity with the conspirators themselves, suspicion that nearly resulted in violence against him on the Senate floor. The personal life of Caesar, beyond the political and military narrative, reveals a figure of considerable personal magnetism and complexity. He was married 3 times. First to Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, whose marriage Sulla had demanded he dissolve and whom he refused to divorce even under threat of death. Then, after Cornelia's death, to Pompeia, a marriage that ended in scandal and divorce after a religious festival held in his house, restricted to women only, was infiltrated by a man named Publius Clodius Pulcher disguised as a woman, reportedly in pursuit of an affair with Pompeia herself, and finally to Calpurnia, who remained his wife until his death and whose ominous dreams the night before the assassination are recorded by multiple ancient sources. Despite divorcing Pompeia on the grounds that suspicion alone was sufficient grounds for divorce for the wife of the Pontifex Maximus, producing his famous statement that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, a phrase that has entered common usage detached from its original specific context. He stated explicitly that he did not believe she had actually committed adultery, illustrating the particular Roman concern with public appearance and reputation that operated alongside, and sometimes independently of, questions of actual personal conduct. His relationships beyond his marriages were the subject of extensive ancient gossip and commentary, some of it certainly exaggerated or invented by political enemies, but consistently enough attested across multiple independent sources to suggest at least a kernel of historical accuracy. His long affair with Servilia, the mother of Brutus, is the most historically significant of these relationships, given the persistent rumors regarding Brutus's actual paternity and the evident favor Caesar showed Brutus throughout his career, despite Brutus having fought against him in the Civil War. Ancient sources also record various relationships during his military campaigns and his extended stay in Egypt with Cleopatra, producing their son Caesarion, whose later fate at the hands of Octavian represents one of the more poignant footnotes to Caesar's own story, a final and fatal complication of his legacy that played out years after his own death. The physical and personal characteristics attributed to Caesar by ancient biographers, particularly Suetonius, present a picture of a man notably concerned with his appearance and his public image. He is described as tall, fair-skinned, with dark, piercing eyes, and notably troubled by his premature baldness, which he attempted to disguise by combing his remaining hair forward, and which he was reportedly delighted to address through the honor, granted by the Senate, of wearing a laurel wreath on all occasions, since the wreath conveniently covered his thinning hair while simultaneously serving as a visible symbol of his military triumphs and his exceptional status. This concern with public image, evident throughout his career from his elaborate aedileship spectacles to his carefully managed publication of the Gallic War commentaries during his absence from Rome, represents one of the most consistently strategic aspects of his political conduct, a sophisticated and largely successful effort to shape public perception that anticipates, in striking ways, the media and image management strategies of much later political figures operating in entirely different technological and institutional contexts. Caesar also suffered, according to ancient sources including his own contemporaries, from what was likely a form of epilepsy, with several recorded instances of seizures occurring during the final years of his life, including, according to some accounts, episodes that may have occurred during his final months when the political pressures surrounding his accumulation of power and the growing conspiracy against him were at their most intense. Whether these episodes had any direct bearing on his political judgment or his apparent disregard for his own safety in the weeks before the assassination, including his dismissal of his bodyguard, remains a matter of historical speculation rather than established fact. But it adds another dimension to the portrait of a man operating under considerable physical as well as political strain during the final phase of his extraordinary career. The administrative and legal reforms that Caesar implemented during his brief period as effectively unchallenged ruler of Rome extended well beyond the calendar reform and the public works projects already discussed, touching nearly every aspect of Roman governance in ways that reveal a systematic and ambitious vision for restructuring the Roman state to better accommodate the realities of imperial governance. He reorganized the Senate itself, increasing its membership substantially and including, controversially in the eyes of traditional Roman aristocrats, provincial notables, and even some descendants of Gauls he had conquered. Individuals whose presence in the chamber that had governed Rome for centuries represented a genuine and deliberate broadening of the traditional Roman political elite to incorporate the empire's expanding base of wealth and talent. He reformed the administration of debt, addressing the chronic problem of indebtedness that had destabilized Roman society for generations, through measures that provided relief to debtors while avoiding the more radical debt cancellation that some populist agitators had demanded, attempting to balance competing interests in a manner characteristic of his broader approach to governance. He also undertook a substantial reorganization of Rome's grain supply and distribution system, addressing both the logistical challenges of feeding an enormous and growing urban population and the political volatility that grain shortages had repeatedly produced in Roman history. His plans, only partially implemented before his death, included significant infrastructure projects intended to improve the harbor facilities at Ostia, Rome's port, and proposals for a canal that would have bypassed the difficult and dangerous sailing route around certain stretches of the Italian coastline, demonstrating an engineering and logistical ambition that extended well beyond the conventional scope of Roman political reform and that anticipated, in its scale and its systematic approach to infrastructure development, the kind of comprehensive state planning that would not become common in Western governance for many centuries afterward. The conspiracy against Caesar, when examined in detail, reveals significant internal divisions and disagreements among the conspirators themselves regarding both the scope of the planned violence and its aftermath. Cassius reportedly argued for the assassination of Mark Antony alongside Caesar, recognizing correctly that Antony's loyalty to Caesar and his considerable political skill made him a likely and dangerous obstacle to the restoration of senatorial governance that the conspirators sought. Brutus, however, insisted that the conspiracy limit itself to Caesar alone, arguing that the assassination should be understood and presented as the elimination of a tyrant rather than a broader purge of his supporters, a position that reflected genuine principle but that proved, in retrospect, to be a catastrophic strategic miscalculation, since it preserved Antony's life and political position precisely at the moment when his skills would prove most dangerous to the conspirators' cause. The conspirators similarly failed to plan adequately for the practical challenges of governance that would follow the assassination, apparently assuming, with what later events revealed to be remarkable naivety, that the elimination of Caesar himself would be sufficient to restore the traditional functioning of republican institutions without requiring any further coordinated action on their part. This failure of practical political planning, set against the meticulous care with which the assassination itself was organized, illustrates a recurring pattern in revolutionary politics across many historical contexts. The capacity for dramatic, decisive action against an existing order frequently exceeds the capacity for constructing a viable alternative to replace what has been destroyed, a pattern that the conspirators' own fate, hunted down and killed within 2 years of their supposedly liberating act, would tragically confirm. The military campaigns that Caesar conducted in Gaul deserve fuller examination beyond the climactic siege of Alesia, because the broader pattern of the conquest reveals important aspects of both his strategic thinking and the brutal realities of Roman imperial expansion. The wars began, ostensibly, as a response to the migration of the Helvetii, a Gallic tribe from what is now Switzerland, who sought to relocate their entire population westward through Roman allied territory in 58 BCE. Caesar, governing the province of Transalpine Gaul at the time, used this migration as justification for military intervention, defeating the Helvetii in battle and compelling the survivors to return to their original territory, an episode that established the pattern that would characterize much of his subsequent conduct in Gaul, presenting interventions as defensive responses to threats against Roman interests or Roman allies, while pursuing an underlying strategic objective of bringing the entirety of Gaul under direct or indirect Roman control. The campaign against the Germanic chieftain Ariovistus later in the same year followed a similar pattern, with Caesar intervening militarily against a Germanic warlord who had been invited into Gaul years earlier by rival Gallic tribes seeking assistance in their internal conflicts, but whose growing power and territorial demands had come to alarm even those Gallic leaders who had initially welcomed his intervention. Caesar's defeat of Ariovistus, driving Germanic forces back across the Rhine, established a pattern of Roman intervention in Gallic affairs that would continue and intensify throughout the following years, with Caesar increasingly positioning Rome, and himself personally, as the dominant arbiter of power across the entire Gallic territory. The subsequent years of campaigning extended Roman control progressively northward and westward, encompassing the Belgic tribes of what is now northern France and Belgium, the maritime tribes along the Atlantic coast, and eventually expeditions across the English Channel into Britain itself in 55 and 54 BCE. These British expeditions, while militarily inconclusive and not resulting in permanent Roman occupation, which would not occur until the following century under the Emperor Claudius, generated enormous attention and prestige in Rome, where the idea of Roman legions crossing into the mysterious island beyond the edge of the known world captured public imagination in ways that more conventional continental campaigns, however militarily significant, could not match. Caesar's own account of these expeditions, included in his commentaries, provided Roman readers with some of their earliest detailed information about British geography, customs, and military practices, information that would remain a primary source for understanding pre-Roman Britain for many centuries afterward. The German campaigns, including Caesar's construction of a remarkable engineering achievement, a bridge across the Rhine completed in just 10 days using a design of his own devising, despite the river's width and strong current, demonstrated both the technical sophistication of Roman military engineering and Caesar's own evident interest in achievements that combined practical military objectives with displays of technical and organizational capability calculated to impress both his own troops and observers back in Rome. The bridge itself served limited immediate military purpose, since Caesar's subsequent operations east of the Rhine were brief, and he soon withdrew and dismantled the structure. But the achievement of building it at all, an engineering feat that ancient and modern military historians alike have continued to study and admire, served Caesar's broader purpose of demonstrating Roman capability and reach to Germanic tribes who might otherwise have considered the Rhine an impassable barrier, protecting them from Roman power. The pattern of resistance and rebellion that punctuated the Gallic campaigns, culminating in, but not limited to, the Great Rebellion of Vercingetorix, reflected the genuine and often justified Gallic perception that Roman intervention, however it might be initially justified or invited by particular factions in intertribal conflicts, ultimately aimed at the comprehensive subjugation of Gallic independence and the imposition of Roman political and economic domination. The revolt of the Eburones under their leader Ambiorix in 54 BCE, which resulted in the destruction of an entire Roman legion and a half through ambush, represented one of the most serious setbacks Caesar suffered during the entire campaign, and his subsequent response, a campaign of deliberate devastation intended to eliminate the Eburones as a political entity entirely, illustrates the genuinely brutal character that Roman counterinsurgency operations could assume when Roman forces, or Roman prestige, had suffered significant reverses. The economic dimensions of the Gallic conquest, often understated in accounts that focus primarily on military and political narrative, were substantial and were central to understanding why Caesar pursued the campaign with such persistent intensity over nearly a decade. The wealth extracted from Gaul through direct plunder, through the enslavement and sale of captured populations, and through the tribute and taxation systems imposed on conquered territories, was enormous, providing Caesar with the financial resources necessary to discharge his substantial personal debts, to fund the political activities of his allies and supporters in Rome, and ultimately to finance the civil war that would follow his return from Gaul. Ancient estimates suggest that the campaign generated wealth sufficient to fundamentally reshape the Roman economy, with gold becoming so abundant in Rome following the conquest that its price relative to silver reportedly declined significantly, a development that ancient sources attribute directly to the volume of Gallic plunder flowing into Roman markets. The civil war itself, beyond the campaigns against Pompey already discussed, involved extensive military operations across nearly the entire Mediterranean world, reflecting the genuinely global scale, by ancient standards, of the conflict between Caesar and the senatorial faction that opposed him. The Alexandrian War, fought in Egypt in support of Cleopatra's claim to the throne against her brother Ptolemy XIII, involved difficult urban fighting within Alexandria itself and culminated in a battle along the Nile, in which Ptolemy XIII was killed, securing Cleopatra's position as sole ruler of Egypt and establishing the alliance, both political and personal, that would persist until Caesar's own death, and that would produce his son Caesarion. The African campaign of 46 BCE, culminating in the Battle of Thapsus, involved Caesar's forces confronting a substantial Pompeian army reinforced by the military resources of the Numidian king Juba, an ally of the Pompeian cause whose kingdom in North Africa provided cavalry and other military support to Caesar's enemies. The defeat of this combined force, and the subsequent suicide of several prominent Pompeian leaders, including Cato the Younger, whose death by suicide rather than submission to Caesar's clemency became, in subsequent Roman and later European political philosophy, an enduring symbol of principled republican resistance to tyranny, marked a decisive phase in the elimination of organized opposition to Caesar's authority. The final campaign of the Civil War against Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus Pompeius in Spain, culminating in the Battle of Munda in 45 BCE, was, according to Caesar's own later reported comments, the most dangerous battle of his entire career, a conflict in which the outcome remained genuinely uncertain for much of the engagement and in which Caesar himself reportedly considered, at one critical juncture, taking his own life rather than face capture before the tide of battle eventually turned decisively in his favor. The brutality of this final campaign, including the systematic execution of captured enemy soldiers in a departure from Caesar's earlier and more famous policy of clemency, suggests both the accumulated exhaustion of nearly 5 years of continuous civil conflict and a hardening of Caesar's approach to remaining resistance as he sought finally and conclusively to eliminate any continued military challenge to his authority. The intellectual and literary culture of late Republican Rome, within which Caesar operated as both participant and exceptional practitioner, provides important context for understanding his achievements as a writer alongside his achievements as a general and statesman. Rome in the 1st century BC, it was experiencing a period of remarkable literary and intellectual flourishing, heavily influenced by Greek models, but increasingly developing distinctively Roman forms and concerns. Cicero, Caesar's contemporary and frequently his political opponent, was simultaneously producing the speeches, philosophical treatises, and letters that would establish Latin prose as a vehicle for sophisticated philosophical and rhetorical expression. Lucretius was composing his great philosophical poem on Epicurean physics. Catullus and his circle were developing new and intensely personal forms of Latin lyric poetry. Caesar's own literary production, though narrower in scope than these contemporaries, focusing almost exclusively on his own military and political achievements, was nonetheless recognized by ancient critics as representing a distinctive and influential prose style. The particular qualities of Caesar's prose, which ancient critics, including Cicero, specifically praised, included a deliberate avoidance of rhetorical ornamentation in favor of clarity and directness, a preference that reflected both Caesar's personal temperament and a broader theoretical position regarding the proper relationship between style and content that he articulated in a now largely lost treatise on Latin grammar and usage called De Analogia, composed, remarkably, while he was crossing the Alps during one of his military campaigns. This treatise argued for a conception of correct Latin usage based on logical consistency and avoidance of unnecessary novelty or affectation, principles that align closely with the practice evident in his own historical commentaries and that influenced subsequent Roman thinking about prose style for generations. The composition and circulation of the commentaries themselves illuminate the sophisticated media strategy that Caesar pursued throughout his Gallic campaigns. Each book of the Gallic War commentary appears to have been composed and circulated in Rome on a roughly annual basis, corresponding to each year's campaigning season, allowing Caesar to maintain continuous public visibility and to shape the narrative of his achievements in close to real time, rather than waiting until the campaign's conclusion to present a single retrospective account. This strategy, while serving the obvious purpose of maintaining and building popular support during his extended absence from Roman political life, also represents a genuinely innovative approach to political communication, anticipating in striking ways much later developments in the strategic use of mass media by political and military leaders seeking to control public narrative during extended military campaigns. The question of historical accuracy and reliability in Caesar's own account of his campaigns has been extensively debated by both ancient and modern scholars. While the basic chronological and geographical framework of the commentaries appears to be generally reliable and is corroborated by archaeological evidence at sites, including Alesia, where French archaeological investigations in the 19th and 20th centuries confirmed the basic accuracy of Caesar's description of the Roman fortifications. Scholars have noted numerous instances where Caesar's account appears to minimize his own setbacks, exaggerate enemy numbers and atrocities to justify his own military actions, and present his motivations and decisions in the most favorable possible light. This combination of substantial factual reliability regarding events alongside significant interpretive bias regarding motivation and justification represents a pattern common to political memoir and self-presentation across many historical periods. And recognizing this pattern allows modern readers to extract genuine historical value from the commentaries, while remaining appropriately critical of their more interpretive and self-justifying elements. The broader cultural impact of Caesar's military and political career on Roman society extended well beyond the immediate political consequences already discussed, touching virtually every aspect of Roman life and self-understanding. The Roman triumph that Caesar celebrated in 46 BCE, an elaborate public ceremony marking his military victories that traditionally celebrated success against foreign rather than fellow Roman enemies, was unprecedented in its scale and duration, lasting for several days, and including separate triumphal processions celebrating his victories in Gaul, Egypt, the East, and Africa. The triumph included the public display of captured treasures, prisoners, and elaborate theatrical representations of his various campaigns, along with gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, and public feasts on a scale that ancient sources describe with evident astonishment, representing both a genuine celebration of military achievement and a calculated political spectacle intended to cement Caesar's position as the preeminent figure in Roman public life. The controversial inclusion of a triumph celebrating victory in Africa, where Caesar's defeated enemies had been fellow Romans rather than foreign adversaries, technically violated the traditional restriction of triumphal celebrations to victories against external enemies, and Caesar's solution, presenting this triumph as a celebration of victory over King Juba of Numidia rather than over the Roman citizens who had fought alongside him, illustrates the kind of careful political and symbolic management that characterized Caesar's approach to maintaining traditional Roman forms while substantially altering their underlying content and significance, a pattern that would recur throughout his subsequent assumption of increasingly monarchical powers, while maintaining the outward vocabulary and institutional forms of republican governance. Caesar's relationship with the city of Rome itself, beyond his political and military achievements, included substantial architectural and urban planning ambitions that, while only partially realized before his death, reveal a vision for transforming Rome's physical landscape to better reflect and accommodate its status as the capital of a Mediterranean-wide empire. His plans for a new forum, the Forum of Caesar, constructed adjacent to the traditional Roman Forum and centered on a temple dedicated to Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestor from whom the Julian family claimed descent, represented both a practical response to the inadequate space available in the original forum for conducting the legal and political business of an increasingly complex imperial administration, and a deliberate architectural statement asserting Caesar's own family's distinguished, and indeed divine lineage, reinforcing the broader narrative of exceptional destiny that had characterized his self-presentation throughout his career. The destruction of the Roman Republic's traditional political culture, which Caesar's career both exemplified and accelerated, did not occur as a single dramatic rupture, but rather as the culmination of a longer process of institutional erosion that had been underway for decades before Caesar's own rise to prominence. The careers of earlier figures, including Marius and Sulla, had already demonstrated that Roman political and military institutions could be bent to serve individual ambition in ways that violated traditional constitutional norms, and the increasing frequency and intensity of political violence throughout the 1st century BCE, including the murders of the Gracchi brothers, the proscriptions under Sulla, and numerous lesser instances of political intimidation and violence throughout Caesar's own political career, had already substantially eroded the norms of restraint and collective governance that had historically distinguished Roman republican political culture from the more overtly autocratic systems of governance common elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Caesar's particular genius, if it can be characterized in a single formulation, lay in his ability to recognize and exploit the structural weaknesses that this longer process of institutional erosion had created, combining unprecedented military success and personal popularity with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate and ultimately transform Roman political institutions from within, rather than through the kind of open and immediate seizure of power that earlier figures like Sulla had pursued through more directly violent means. This approach, while ultimately proving fatal to Caesar himself when the senatorial aristocracy concluded that his accumulation of power represented an intolerable threat to their own traditional position and to the broader principles of collective republican governance, nonetheless established patterns of political behavior and constitutional adaptation that his successor Augustus would study carefully and refine, ultimately succeeding where Caesar had failed in establishing a durable and broadly accepted alternative to traditional republican governance. The question of Caesar's ultimate intentions, whether he genuinely sought to establish a formal hereditary monarchy or whether his accumulation of extraordinary personal power represented a more pragmatic response to the genuine governmental challenges facing an empire that had outgrown its republican institutional framework, remains, as already noted, a matter of ongoing historical debate that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. What can be said with greater confidence is that the specific form of governance that emerged from the wreckage of the civil wars that followed his assassination, the Augustan Principate that combined effectively monarchical authority with the careful maintenance of traditional republican vocabulary and institutional forms, represents a sophisticated political solution that built directly upon precedents and innovations that Caesar himself had pioneered, suggesting that whatever Caesar's own specific intentions may have been, his career had effectively demonstrated both the necessity and the practical possibility of a fundamentally transformed system of Roman governance, a demonstration that his assassination could delay but ultimately could not prevent from reaching its logical historical conclusion. The legal and constitutional mechanisms through which Caesar accumulated his extraordinary powers deserve closer examination, since they illustrate the particular genius and the particular danger of his approach to political transformation. Rather than simply seizing power through naked military force, as a more conventional usurper might have done, Caesar consistently worked to obtain his various extraordinary powers through nominally legitimate constitutional processes, however much those processes were distorted or coerced by the military and political pressure he was able to bring to bear. His initial dictatorship, granted in 49 BCE during the early phase of the Civil War, was technically authorized through traditional constitutional mechanisms, even though the circumstances under which it was granted, with Caesar's army occupying Rome itself, made any genuine deliberative process effectively impossible. This pattern of maintaining scrupulous formal legality while substantively undermining the genuine deliberative and competitive character of republican institutions would characterize his entire approach to political power throughout the remainder of his career. The Senate's grant of the dictatorship in perpetuity in February of 44 BCE, just weeks before the assassination, represents the culmination of this process, and it is worth considering why the senatorial aristocracy, despite their evident and ultimately murderous resentment of Caesar's accumulation of power, nonetheless continued to grant him increasingly extraordinary formal authorities right up until the moment of his death. Part of the explanation lies in simple political reality. With Caesar's victory in the Civil War complete and his military forces and popular support overwhelming, the Senate had little practical alternative to formal accommodation, since open resistance through traditional constitutional channels offered no realistic prospect of success. But part of the explanation also lies in the genuine ambivalence that many senators felt, recognizing that Caesar's personal authority, however constitutionally irregular its origins, was providing a degree of stability and effective governance that the chronic political violence and institutional dysfunction of the preceding decades had conspicuously failed to deliver. This ambivalence helps explain why the conspiracy against Caesar, when it finally formed, drew support not only from committed former supporters of Pompey, who had personal or family reasons to resent Caesar's victory in the Civil War, but also from men whom Caesar had personally pardoned, promoted, and treated with conspicuous favor throughout the preceding years, including Brutus himself. The conspirators were not, for the most part, men motivated by simple personal grievance or thwarted ambition, but rather by a genuine, if ultimately catastrophically miscalculated, belief that the preservation of republican liberty, understood specifically as the absence of any single dominant individual standing permanently above the collective governance of the senatorial aristocracy, justified the assassination of a man who had, in many other respects, treated them generously and who had, demonstrated genuine capability and apparent good intention in his exercise of his extraordinary powers. The aftermath of the assassination, beyond the immediate political chaos already discussed, also produced significant and lasting effects on Roman religious and cultural life that deserve mention. Caesar was formally deified by the Senate in 42 BCE, becoming the first Roman to receive this honor, an act that retroactively transformed Octavian, his adopted son, into the son of a god, Divi Filius, a title that Octavian used extensively and strategically throughout his subsequent political career to enhance his own legitimacy and authority. This deification, building on the precedent of ruler cult that had developed in the Hellenistic kingdoms that had succeeded Alexander the Great's empire and with which Caesar himself had direct personal experience through his relationship with Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic court, established a pattern of imperial deification that would continue, with varying degrees of sincerity and political calculation, throughout the subsequent history of the Roman Empire, fundamentally altering the relationship between Roman political authority and Roman religious practice in ways that persisted for centuries. The comet that appeared in the skies over Rome during the games that Octavian held in Caesar's honor shortly after his assassination and subsequent deification was widely interpreted, both by contemporary observers and in subsequent Roman tradition, as a sign confirming Caesar's ascension to divine status, his soul transformed into a star visible in the heavens. This celestial phenomenon, known in Latin sources as the Sidus Iulium, the Julian star, became an important element of the visual and symbolic propaganda that Octavian employed throughout his rise to power, appearing on coins and in artistic representations that reinforced the connection between Caesar's divine status and Octavian's own legitimacy as his chosen heir, illustrating once again the sophisticated use of symbolic and religious authority that characterized the political culture Caesar had done so much to shape, even in the years immediately following his death. The long-term historiographical legacy of Caesar, the way his life and career have been interpreted, reinterpreted, and deployed for various political and cultural purposes across the centuries since his death, represents its own substantial and fascinating subject. Medieval European political thought, operating within a context of feudal monarchy quite different from the republican and imperial Roman context within which Caesar himself operated, nonetheless drew extensively on Caesar's career and his own writings as models for political and military conduct, with the commentaries serving as standard educational texts for medieval and early modern European elites learning both Latin language and, implicitly, lessons regarding effective military leadership and political strategy. The medieval and early modern use of the title Caesar, transformed into Kaiser in German lands and Tsar in Slavic territories, as the standard title for supreme political authority, reflects the remarkably persistent cultural authority that Caesar's name and reputation continued to carry many centuries after the specific historical and constitutional circumstances of his own career had become a distant and largely theoretical historical memory rather than a living political reality. The Renaissance revival of classical learning brought renewed and more historically sophisticated attention to Caesar's career, with Italian humanist scholars producing detailed historical and philological studies of his writings and his political conduct, while Renaissance political theorists, including most famously Niccolò Machiavelli, drew extensively on Caesar's career as a case study in the practical exercise of political and military power, though Machiavelli's own assessment of Caesar was notably more ambivalent and critical than the largely admiring tradition that had characterized much earlier medieval reception, reflecting Machiavelli's own particular concern with the dangers that excessive individual ambition posed to republican institutions, a concern that drew directly on the cautionary historical lessons that Caesar's own career and its violent termination seem to offer. Shakespeare's play, composed in 1599 and drawing primarily on the English translation of Plutarch's biographical account, has done more than any other single work to shape popular understanding and cultural memory of Caesar's assassination in the English-speaking world and indeed globally. Given the play's continued and extensive performance and adaptation across many languages and cultural contexts in the centuries since its composition, the play's sophisticated and deliberately ambiguous treatment of the moral and political questions surrounding the assassination, refusing to offer any simple or definitive judgment regarding whether Brutus and his fellow conspirators were justified in their actions or whether Caesar himself represented a genuine tyrannical threat to Roman liberty, has ensured the play's continued relevance and continued capacity to generate fresh interpretation and debate across many different historical and political contexts in which it has subsequently been performed and studied, from its original Elizabethan context, in which concerns regarding succession and the proper limits of monarchical authority carried obvious contemporary political resonance, through countless subsequent productions that have drawn explicit or implicit parallels to the political circumstances of their own particular historical moments. Modern historical scholarship on Caesar, building on the methodological developments of 19th and 20th century historical and archaeological research, has continued to refine and in some cases substantially revise earlier understanding of his career and its broader historical significance. Archaeological investigation at sites associated with his military campaigns, particularly the extensive excavations conducted at Alesia beginning in the 19th century under the patronage of the French Emperor Napoleon III, who maintained a particular personal and political interest in Caesar as a historical figure whose career offered instructive parallels to his own political circumstances, have provided physical confirmation of many details in Caesar's own written accounts, while also revealing additional information regarding the scale and sophistication of Roman military engineering that supplements and occasionally corrects details in the ancient literary sources. The continued scholarly and popular fascination with Caesar, more than 2,000 years after his death, reflects the genuinely exceptional nature of his historical impact and the enduring relevance of the political and constitutional questions that his career raises regarding the proper balance between effective governance and the preservation of collective political liberty, between the legitimate exercise of extraordinary individual talent and ambition and the dangers that such ambition poses to established institutions and traditional checks on concentrated power. These questions, while obviously shaped by the specific historical circumstances of late Republican Rome, nonetheless carry a more general and enduring relevance to political thought and political practice across many subsequent historical contexts, ensuring that Caesar's story continues to attract serious historical attention and continues to provoke genuine reflection regarding the fundamental challenges of political organization and governance that no human society has ever entirely or permanently resolved. The geographic and demographic scope of Caesar's military campaigns, when considered in their entirety across his career, reveals the truly extraordinary scale of territorial and human impact that a single Roman general could achieve within the political and military framework of the late Republic. From the Atlantic coast of Gaul to the deserts of North Africa, from the islands of Britain to the cities of Egypt and the battlefields of Spain, Caesar's military operations touched territories spanning thousands of kilometers and encompassing dozens of distinct peoples, languages, and political systems, each requiring different strategic and diplomatic approaches, even as they were ultimately subordinated to the singular and increasingly personal authority that Caesar had constructed for himself within the formal structures of Roman republican governance. The administrative challenges that this territorial expansion created, even setting aside the immediate political crisis that followed Caesar's assassination, illustrate the genuine structural problems that Roman governance faced in adapting traditional city-state institutions to the realities of administering a Mediterranean-wide empire. The provincial system that had developed gradually over the preceding 2 centuries, through which conquered territories were organized under the authority of annually rotating Roman governors, had never been designed with the scale and diversity of Caesar's own conquests in mind, and the strain that his Gallic campaigns in particular placed on existing administrative frameworks helped drive the broader reforms to provincial governance that Caesar implemented during his brief period of supreme authority, reforms that his successor Augustus would subsequently develop and systematize into the more comprehensive imperial administrative structure that would govern the Roman world for the following centuries. The relationship between Caesar's military command structure and his political authority in Rome also deserves further attention, since it illustrates the particular mechanism through which personal military loyalty was gradually transformed into a foundation for political power that operated largely independently of, and increasingly in tension with, traditional senatorial and popular constitutional authority. The legions that Caesar commanded in Gaul, recruited and trained under his personal authority over nearly a decade of continuous campaigning, developed a level of loyalty to Caesar personally that exceeded their formal loyalty to the Roman state, a development that several of Caesar's contemporaries, including Pompey himself, had already begun to recognize as a fundamental and dangerous shift in the relationship between military force and political authority within the late Republican system. This personal loyalty was reinforced through Caesar's careful and consistent attention to the material welfare of his soldiers, including pay, plunder, and crucially the promise and eventual delivery of land grants for veterans upon their retirement from service, commitments that Caesar fulfilled with notable reliability throughout his career. In contrast to the more inconsistent and politically contested process through which earlier Roman generals had attempted to secure similar benefits for their own veteran soldiers through the often obstructive mechanisms of senatorial approval. This reliability, combined with Caesar's evident personal courage and his consistent practice of sharing the physical hardships of campaign life with his ordinary soldiers rather than maintaining the more aloof and privileged distance that aristocratic Roman commanders had traditionally preserved, generated a depth of soldierly devotion that proved decisive when Caesar ultimately called upon his legions to follow him across the Rubicon in direct defiance of explicit senatorial authority. The economic and social consequences of Caesar's extensive land redistribution programs, both during his Gallic command and during his subsequent period of supreme authority in Rome, extended well beyond the immediate political benefit of securing military loyalty, representing a genuine and significant intervention in the broader structural problems of land distribution and rural poverty that had destabilized Roman society for generations. The settlement of tens of thousands of veteran soldiers and displaced urban poor in colonies established across Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa during Caesar's dictatorship represented one of the most substantial programs of organized population resettlement in ancient Mediterranean history, addressing chronic urban overcrowding in Rome itself, while simultaneously extending Roman cultural and political influence into newly conquered or newly stabilized territories through the establishment of loyal and economically productive settler communities. These colonial foundations, many of which developed into significant and enduring urban centers that persisted long after the political circumstances of their original establishment had become a distant historical memory, represent one of the more lasting and constructive aspects of Caesar's broader legacy, contributing substantially to the long-term process of urbanization and economic development that characterized the Western Roman provinces throughout the subsequent centuries of imperial governance. Cities including Arlate in southern Gaul, modern Alps, and numerous settlements across Spain and North Africa trace their origins or their significant urban development directly to Caesar's colonial foundation programs, illustrating the genuine and lasting constructive impact that his policies had on the physical and economic landscape of the Western Mediterranean world, an impact that persisted and indeed deepened considerably under the more systematic imperial administration that his successors subsequently established. The financial and economic dimensions of Caesar's career, beyond the immediate wealth generated through military conquest and plunder already discussed, also illuminate broader patterns in late Republican Roman economic and financial practice that his career both exemplified and significantly influenced. The scale of personal debt that Caesar accumulated during his early political career, debt that by some ancient estimates reached extraordinary proportions even by the standards of an aristocratic political culture in which substantial personal debt was a common and broadly accepted feature of competitive political advancement, illustrates the close and often problematic relationship between personal financial credit, political ambition, and the ultimately violent or coercive mechanisms, including military conquest and civil war, through which ambitious Roman politicians frequently sought to resolve the financial obligations they had incurred in pursuit of political advancement. Caesar's particular skill in managing this relationship between debt, credit, and political advancement, securing sufficient financial backing from wealthy associates, including initially Crassus, to fund his early political career, while maintaining the political relationships and reputation necessary to eventually discharge these obligations through the wealth generated by his subsequent military commands, represents one of the less frequently discussed but nonetheless significant aspects of his broader political and strategic acumen, illustrating a sophisticated understanding of the financial mechanisms underlying Roman political competition that complemented his more frequently celebrated military and rhetorical talents. The broader pattern of debt, military conquest, and political advancement that characterized Caesar's career, while extreme in its scale and its ultimate consequences, was not entirely unique within the broader context of late Republican Roman political culture, reflecting structural features of a political system in which formal office holding required substantial personal financial outlay, in which provincial governorships and military commands offered the primary legitimate mechanism through which such outlay could be recovered and converted into further political advancement, and in which the resulting incentive structure consistently rewarded military aggression and provincial exploitation over more cautious or restrained approaches to imperial governance. Understanding this broader structural context helps explain why Caesar's career, however exceptional in its ultimate scale and consequence, nonetheless developed along lines that were recognizable and indeed almost predictable extensions of patterns that had already been well established by earlier generations of ambitious Roman political and military leaders. The final assessment of Caesar's historical significance, attempted by countless historians, biographers, and political theorists across the more than 2,000 years since his death, inevitably remains contested and provisional, shaped as much by the particular political and intellectual concerns of each subsequent generation of interpreters as by the surviving ancient evidence itself. What remains beyond reasonable historical dispute is the simple but profound fact that few individuals in recorded human history have so comprehensively and so permanently altered the trajectory of an entire civilization through the combined force of their military, political, and even literary achievement, leaving a legacy so substantial and so multifaceted that more than 2 millennia later, his name continues to serve, across dozens of languages and cultural contexts, as a virtual synonym for supreme political authority, while his own written words continue to be read, studied, and admired by students and scholars who approach his legacy from countless different historical, cultural, and political perspectives, each finding in his extraordinary and ultimately tragic career fresh material for understanding the enduring and unresolved tensions between individual ambition, effective governance, and the preservation of collective political liberty that no human society, ancient or modern, has ever entirely or permanently succeeded in resolving. The religious dimensions of Roman political life, within which Caesar operated throughout his entire career, and which his own position as Pontifex Maximus placed him at the very center of, deserve further consideration, since the close intertwining of religious and political authority in Roman society shaped nearly every aspect of public life in ways that modern readers, accustomed to greater institutional separation between religious and political authority, can sometimes underestimate. Roman state religion was not primarily a matter of personal belief or spiritual conviction in the manner that later religious traditions would emphasize, but rather a complex system of ritual obligation and divine consultation through which the Roman state sought to maintain proper relationship with the gods whose favor was understood to be essential for military success, agricultural prosperity, and general civic well-being. The augurs, who interpreted the flight patterns of birds and other natural signs to determine whether proposed political or military actions carried divine sanction, and the haruspices, who examined the entrails of sacrificed animals for similar purposes, occupied positions of genuine institutional authority within Roman public life, and their pronouncements, while certainly subject to political manipulation and strategic interpretation by those with sufficient influence to shape how particular omens were read, nonetheless carried real weight in shaping public perception and occasionally in constraining or justifying particular political and military decisions. Caesar's own relationship with these religious institutions and practices, while clearly instrumentalized for political purposes on numerous occasions throughout his career, also reflected genuine engagement with the religious framework that structured Roman public life, and his position as Pontifex Maximus placed him in direct personal responsibility for maintaining the proper performance of state religious obligations throughout the tumultuous final decades of the Republic. The calendar reform that Caesar implemented represents perhaps the clearest example of how his religious authority as Pontifex Maximus intersected with his broader political and administrative reforms, since the traditional Roman calendar, based on lunar cycles and requiring periodic intercalation, the insertion of additional days or months to maintain alignment with the solar year, had become so disorganized through decades of inconsistent and politically motivated intercalary adjustments, that by the time of Caesar's reform, the official calendar had drifted nearly 3 months out of alignment with the actual solar seasons. This misalignment created genuine practical problems for agricultural planning, religious festival timing, and military campaign scheduling, problems that Caesar's reform, implemented with the assistance of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, decisively resolved through the introduction of a fixed 365-day year with periodic leap years, a system so fundamentally sound in its basic astronomical calculation that, with only the minor refinement introduced by the Gregorian reform of 1582, it remains the basis of the calendar system used globally today, representing perhaps the single most enduring and universally adopted practical legacy of Caesar's entire career. The year 46 BCE, during which this calendar reform was implemented, required the insertion of additional intercalary days to correct the accumulated drift in the traditional calendar, resulting in a year of 445 days, sometimes called by later historians the last year of confusion. after which the new Julian calendar took effect with its regular and astronomically accurate annual cycle. This dramatic but necessary adjustment illustrates both the practical scope of Caesar's reforming ambition and his willingness to implement disruptive but genuinely beneficial changes to fundamental aspects of Roman public life, a pattern that characterized his broader approach to governance during his brief period of supreme authority, and that, had he lived to implement his full reform agenda, might have produced an even more substantially transformed Roman administrative and legal system than the partial implementation that his assassination ultimately permitted. The role of women in Caesar's political and personal life, beyond his 3 marriages already discussed, illuminates broader patterns regarding the position and influence of elite Roman women during this turbulent period of Roman history, patterns that, while certainly constrained by the formal legal and political exclusion of women from direct participation in Roman public office and political decision-making, nonetheless reveal the substantial and formal influence that women from prominent Roman families could exercise through marriage alliances, financial resources, and personal relationships with influential male relatives and associates. Servilia, mother of Brutus and Caesar's long-term companion, maintained extensive political connections and exercised considerable influence within elite Roman political circles throughout this period, her household serving as an important site of political networking and information exchange, even as she herself remained formally excluded from direct political participation. Caesar's own daughter Julia, whose marriage to Pompey had helped cement the political alliance between her father and her husband during the period of the First Triumvirate, represents a particularly poignant example of how women's lives, and even their deaths, could carry substantial political weight within this system. Since her death in childbirth in 54 BCE, removing a crucial personal bond between Caesar and Pompey is identified by ancient and modern historians alike as a significant contributing factor to the subsequent deterioration of their political alliance and the eventual outbreak of civil war between them, illustrating how thoroughly personal and political considerations remained intertwined within elite Roman society. Even as formal political authority remained the exclusive preserve of male citizens operating within the established constitutional structures of senatorial and popular governance. The broader social and cultural transformations that accompanied the political upheavals of Caesar's lifetime, including significant developments in Roman art, architecture, and material culture that reflected and reinforced the changing political circumstances of the late Republic, provide additional context for understanding the full scope of historical transformation that this period represented. The increasing scale and sophistication of elite private residences in Rome and across Italy during this period, reflecting the enormous wealth flowing into the hands of successful military commanders and provincial administrators, created new architectural and artistic possibilities that would be more fully developed under the subsequent imperial system. While the increasing prominence of portrait sculpture depicting specific identifiable individuals, including ultimately Caesar himself on the coinage minted during his lifetime, reflected broader shifts in Roman visual culture toward greater emphasis on individual identity and achievement that paralleled the broader political shift away from collective senatorial governance toward the kind of personal authority and individual prominence that Caesar's own career had done so much to establish and legitimate. These cultural and artistic developments, while certainly less dramatic and less immediately consequential than the political and military events that dominate most historical accounts of Caesar's career, nonetheless reflect important and enduring transformations in Roman society and Roman self-understanding that paralleled and reinforced the more directly political changes that his career exemplified, contributing to a broader cultural shift toward emphasis on individual achievement and personal authority that would become increasingly characteristic of Roman imperial culture throughout the subsequent centuries of the empire's existence, representing yet another dimension of the comprehensive and lasting transformation that this single extraordinary individual's life and career helped to set in motion within the broader sweep of Roman and indeed world history. The strategic and tactical innovations that Caesar introduced or refined throughout his military career represent a significant contribution to the broader development of ancient military theory and practice, contributions that subsequent Roman and even later European military thinkers studied closely as models of effective command. His consistent emphasis on speed and decisiveness, moving his forces with a rapidity that frequently caught his opponents unprepared, represented a deliberate strategic philosophy rather than simply a personal temperamental preference, reflecting his sophisticated understanding that the psychological and logistical advantages gained through rapid, unexpected movement could often compensate for numerical disadvantages or less favorable tactical positioning. His famous march from Rome to Spain, covering enormous distances in remarkably short periods during the Civil War, exemplifies this broader strategic approach, allowing him to confront and neutralize Pompeian forces in Spain before Pompey himself could fully mobilize the eastern resources upon which his ultimate strategy depended. Caesar's approach to siege warfare, demonstrated most dramatically at Alesia, but evident throughout his campaigns, combined sophisticated engineering capability with a willingness to commit substantial time and resources to achieving decisive results, reflecting his broader strategic preference for achieving complete and unambiguous victories rather than negotiated settlements that might leave residual threats capable of regrouping and renewing resistance at a later and potentially less favorable moment. This preference for decisive resolution, evident equally in his military campaigns and in his political conduct, including his policy of clemency designed to definitively eliminate the political viability of continued opposition rather than simply defeating it militarily while leaving its underlying causes unaddressed, reflects a consistent strategic temperament that distinguished Caesar from many of his contemporaries and that substantially contributed to his remarkable record of military and political success across nearly 2 decades of nearly continuous conflict and competition. The legacy of Caesar's military writings on subsequent military theory and education extends well beyond their value as historical sources, since the commentaries were studied not merely as historical documents, but as practical instructional texts by subsequent generations of military commanders seeking to understand and apply the tactical and strategic principles that Caesar's campaigns exemplified. Renaissance and early modern European military theorists, operating within a cultural context that placed enormous value on classical precedent and classical learning, drew extensively on Caesar's recorded campaigns when developing their own theoretical frameworks for understanding effective military leadership and strategic decision-making, ensuring that Caesar's practical military legacy extended far beyond the immediate historical context of his own campaigns to influence military thinking. Across many subsequent centuries and many different cultural and technological contexts, the final months of Caesar's life, beyond the immediate circumstances of the conspiracy and assassination already discussed in detail, reveal a man apparently engaged in ambitious planning for the future even as the conspiracy that would end his life was actively forming around him. His planned campaign against the Parthian Empire, intended to avenge the catastrophic defeat and death of Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae a decade earlier, represented a military undertaking of enormous scope and ambition, potentially extending Roman military and political influence deep into territories that no Roman army had previously penetrated successfully. The preparations for this campaign, including the assembly of substantial military forces and supplies, were well underway at the time of his assassination, leading some historians to speculate that the conspirators may have been motivated partly by anxiety that a successful Parthian campaign would further cement Caesar's already overwhelming military prestige and personal authority, making any subsequent challenge to his position increasingly difficult to contemplate. The irony that Caesar's own death prevented the completion of this campaign, while his adoptive son and eventual successor Octavian would later achieve, through diplomatic rather than military means, a resolution to the ongoing tension with Parthia that proved considerably more durable and less costly than continued military conflict might have produced, illustrates the broader pattern of historical contingency and unintended consequence that characterizes so much of Caesar's ultimate legacy, in which his own specific intentions and planned actions were frequently overtaken or redirected by the unpredictable consequences of his assassination and the subsequent political transformations that this act of violence set irreversibly in motion. The final assessment that any careful historical examination of Caesar's life must ultimately offer is one of profound and enduring complexity, resistant to simple categorization as either straightforward hero or straightforward villain, reformer or tyrant, savior or destroyer of Roman liberty. He was, by the clear weight of historical evidence, a man of extraordinary and genuinely exceptional talent across multiple distinct domains of human achievement, military command, political strategy, administrative reform, and literary composition. Talents that he deployed with a consistency of ambition and a ruthlessness of execution that ultimately proved both his greatest strength and the direct cause of his violent death. The Roman Republic that he inherited was already, by the time of his birth, a political system under severe and arguably unsustainable strain, and whether his own career should be understood primarily as an opportunistic exploitation of existing institutional weakness or as a genuine, if ultimately personally fatal, attempt to resolve genuine structural problems that traditional Republican governance had proven increasingly unable to address, remains, as it has remained for more than 2,000 years, a question that each generation of historians and each individual reader must ultimately answer for themselves, drawing on the substantial but inevitably incomplete and interpretively contested evidence that survives from this most consequential and most thoroughly documented period of ancient Roman history. The veterans of Caesar's legions, settled in colonies across the Mediterranean world after their long years of service, carried with them not only the practical skills and the Latin language that would help spread Roman culture throughout the provinces, but also a particular and enduring loyalty to Caesar's memory that persisted well beyond his death, and that significantly shaped the political alignments of the civil wars that followed. Many of these veterans, when called upon by Octavian in his struggle against Caesar's assassins and later against Antony, responded not merely out of calculation regarding their own material interests, though such calculations certainly played a role, but out of genuine and deeply felt loyalty to the memory of the commander who had led them through years of shared hardship and danger. A loyalty that Octavian skillfully invoked and cultivated throughout his own rise to power, presenting himself consistently and effectively as the legitimate heir and avenger of his adoptive father's memory. This pattern of veteran loyalty extending across generational and even dynastic transitions illustrates a broader and historically significant development in the relationship between military service and political authority that Caesar's career had done much to establish, in which the personal bond between soldiers and their commanding general increasingly took precedence over more abstract loyalty to republican institutions or to the Senate as a collective body. This transformation, while certainly not originating entirely with Caesar himself, since earlier generals, including Marius and Sulla, had already demonstrated similar patterns of personal military loyalty, was nonetheless developed and exploited by Caesar with a thoroughness and a long-term strategic vision that distinguished his approach from these earlier precedents, establishing patterns of civil-military relations that would remain characteristic of Roman imperial politics for centuries. Afterward, occasionally producing severe political instability when competing claimants to imperial authority could each draw upon the personal loyalty of military forces whose primary allegiance lay with their commanders rather than with more abstract constitutional principles or institutions. The historical memory of Caesar within Roman culture itself, during the centuries of imperial rule that followed his death, occupied a complex and evolving position that reflected the broader political needs and self-understanding of successive imperial regimes. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that governed Rome for nearly a century after Augustus's establishment of the Principate maintained an obvious and deliberate connection to Caesar's memory and legacy, given their direct genealogical descent from his adopted family line, ensuring that his reputation and his historical example remained central to imperial ideology and imperial self-presentation throughout this formative period of the developing Roman imperial system. Subsequent dynasties, lacking this direct genealogical connection, nonetheless continued to draw upon Caesar's example and his accumulated symbolic authority, reflected in the continued use of the title Caesar itself as a standard component of imperial nomenclature, a practice that persisted throughout the remainder of Roman imperial history and that extended, as already noted, into the titles employed by various subsequent European and Russian monarchies that claimed some form of continuity with or inheritance from Roman imperial authority. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence for Caesar's life and career, beyond the literary sources already extensively discussed, continues to expand through ongoing research and occasional new discoveries, providing additional texture and occasional correction to the picture that the ancient literary tradition presents. Inscriptions from across the territories that Caesar's campaigns touched, ranging from military dedications and veteran settlement records to administrative documents reflecting the practical implementation of his various political and economic reforms, offer valuable supplementary evidence regarding the practical scope and the lasting impact of his policies. Evidence that generally confirms the broad outline provided by literary sources while occasionally revealing additional complexity or local variation that the more centralized and Rome-focused literary tradition tends to obscure or simplify. The site of Caesar's assassination itself, the theater of Pompey, and its attached Senate meeting hall, has been the subject of significant archaeological investigation in modern Rome, with portions of the structure's foundations identified and studied beneath the dense urban fabric of the modern city, allowing historians and archaeologists to develop an increasingly precise understanding of the physical setting within which this pivotal historical event occurred, even as the overwhelming weight of subsequent urban development across more than 2,000 years has ensured that no visible above-ground remains of the original structure survive for the casual visitor to observe directly, a physical absence that stands in poignant contrast to the otherwise overwhelming and continuous presence of Caesar's broader historical legacy throughout the modern world. This contrast between the almost complete physical disappearance of the specific sites and structures directly associated with Caesar's life and death, and the extraordinarily persistent and pervasive influence of his broader political, calendrical, linguistic, and cultural legacy throughout the subsequent history of Western civilization, captures something essential about the particular nature of historical impact and historical memory that Caesar's career exemplifies. The physical Rome that Caesar knew, walked through, and sought to transform through his ambitious architectural and urban planning projects has been built over, demolished, and reconstructed many times across the intervening centuries, leaving only fragmentary and often deeply buried physical traces accessible to modern archaeological investigation. Yet the calendar that organizes the daily lives of billions of people across the globe continues to follow the basic structure that Caesar established. The month of July continues to bear his name. His own written words continue to be read and studied by students learning Latin in schools and universities across the world. And the fundamental political and constitutional questions that his extraordinary career raised, regarding the proper balance between effective governance and the preservation of collective liberty, between legitimate individual achievement and the dangers of concentrated power, continue to resonate within political thought and political practice across countless different historical and cultural contexts entirely removed from the specific circumstances of the late Roman Republic within which Caesar himself lived, governed, conquered, and ultimately died. This is where the story of Julius Caesar comes to rest. We have followed him from a patrician family in decline, through the dangerous years of Sulla's dictatorship, through the long climb to power, through 8 years of brutal conquest in Gaul, through civil war against his former ally Pompey, through his brief and transformative years as the unchallenged master of Rome, to the bloody morning in the Senate chamber when his own colleagues, believing they were saving the Republic, ended his life and accelerated its final destruction. He was a man of extraordinary contradictions, capable of great mercy and great brutality, a brilliant writer and a reckless general, an aristocrat who built his power on popular support and ultimately accumulated more personal authority than any Roman before him. He changed the calendar we still use. He gave his name to the month of July and, indirectly, to the words for emperor in languages across Europe and Asia. He set in motion, through his death as much as through his life, the transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire that would shape the next 5 centuries of Western civilization. The Senate floor where he fell has been gone for nearly 2,000 years. The marble columns of the theater of Pompey, where the assassination took place, lie buried beneath the streets of modern Rome. But the calendar still turns through July. The Rubicon still flows, somewhere in northern Italy, though its exact ancient course is now uncertain. And the question of what he was, reformer or tyrant, savior or destroyer of the Republic, is still being asked, more than 2,000 years after the conspirators' daggers fell silent on that March morning. Sleep well. Good night.